Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. My name is Tyler Golato, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Molecule. Today, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about my company and some of the work that we do to try to create collaborative development frameworks in the context of drug development, and specifically how we're beginning to apply some of those processes to the longevity space to try to decentralize and democratize investment into promising longevity assets. Please bear with me for a second while I share my screen. Great. So Molecule is a company that's really focused on decentralizing drug development processes by enabling scientists to secure financing and collaboratively commercialize therapeutics. And we're really focused on trying to help researchers out of academia, particularly those that are working in translational aspects of drug development, to be able to take their projects and gain commercial investment into them and even public investment into them, to create frameworks to move those therapeutics closer to patients without the actual researcher needing to found a startup company, which tends to be a significant problem in industry at the moment in academia. Today, pharma is facing an innovation crisis, and really drug development has never been more slow, expensive, and risky. And this trend over the past 20 years has really been accelerating, and we tend to see the market dynamics in the pharmaceutical industry trying to respond to this problem in various ways. But at present, in the United States, it costs anywhere from $800 million to $2.5 billion to develop a drug. There's a relatively low chance of success because of the sort of shotgun and funnel models that pharmaceutical companies typically apply. And the time to market tends to be quite long. So this is a very risk-prone process that only really a few large companies have the sort of capital and ability to shoulder. And because of this, many potential treatments never really reach patients. And many of those that do are really the ones that are, let's say, have high profit margins. And in many cases are too expensive or access is relatively restricted. That said, simultaneously, most early stage therapeutics are really being developed out of academia and in these sort of early stage spin-offs and biotech startups. And pharmaceutical companies, because of this innovation crisis that they're facing and because of the declining IRR on in-house pharmaceutical research and development, are increasingly buying their innovation. At the moment, only 12% of preclinical assets are owned by large pharmaceutical companies, while the remaining 88% reside in academia and biotech, and sort of at this very difficult translational stage where you have to move from the sort of basic science into the clinical realm. Academia tends to be quite good at basic science and early translational work, but the cost and risk and infrastructure required to actually bring therapeutics to market is quite difficult, and it's something that industry tends to have much more experience with. So this creates a number of difficulties for academics who do have good ideas and have good therapeutics that they are wishing to bring to patients. At the stage, researchers and universities are typically struggling to obtain financing and commercialize their technologies. Investors in pharma companies are also typically struggling to find quality deal flow, do due diligence, and also biotech investments are highly illiquid. There's also constraints such as geographical restrictions, meaning that there are many sort of underventured universities with very good ideas that are sort of outside of your traditional biotech hotspots like San Francisco, Boston, Oxford, et cetera. And beyond this, many of these companies, spin-outs, and even academic institutions struggle to find development partners and collaborators to assist with early stage asset development. And in a sense, you could sort of boil this down into a marketplace dynamics problem. You could say that pharma really lacks an efficient marketplace to be able to either facilitate some of these processes, purchase its innovation, collaborate, et cetera. On the supply side, drug developers face really enormous challenges. These are sort of researchers, universities, biotech, AI, drug discovery companies, where they face problems with their projects being discovered by people who are interested in investing and helping them. They lack access to financing, particularly in these more commercial facing stages, often really require strong collaborators and partners in order to be successful. But this can also pose a number of challenges. And often universities particularly are poorly equipped for commercial efforts. Tech transfer offices have a broad sort of range of skills and experience and track record when it comes to successfully commercializing therapeutics. On the other side, investors, patients, and industry also have a problem. Things like deal sourcing and deal execution, being able to do due diligence and evaluation on a very broad range of assets that cover a number of therapeutic areas and require specific expertise, being geographically restricted. Also problems like data access and data being sort of siloed or opaque, and other problems such as the dark art of IP pricing and the liquidity that exists in these spaces. Molecule essentially tries to solve these problems by uniting scientists, investors, and pharmaceutical companies on a collaborative and global platform that facilitates their discovery, financing, and data collaboration. And the goal is really to develop new collaborative frameworks that are based on decentralized technologies that enable multiple stakeholders to share in the success and the risk of developing new therapeutics. Molecule is aiming to host hundreds of drug development projects and create this multi-sided marketplace where researchers can upload their projects or their assets onto a globally discoverable and searchable platform. Financing can be easily obtained, and we have sort of a legal SPV process that tries to standardize that financing, basically moving these assets into these special purpose vehicles that are virtual pharmaceutical companies, through which we can distribute equity to other collaborators in exchange for their work, or to investors to then fund the therapeutics continuous development. And researchers globally can contribute work in exchange for equity. On the other side, for investors, deal sourcing becomes global and you lift some of the geographical restrictions. Intellectual property becomes a new asset in itself, which is investable, liquid, and fractionally tradable. And research data is digitally accessible and also protected, but it can be peer reviewed by stakeholders within these systems in a GitHub sort of style. And the goal here is really to eventually move towards a more open source or entirely open source way of developing drugs, where you still have some protections and frameworks in place for people to be able to collaboratively commercialize therapeutics. As I mentioned, it's really focused on decentralizing the earliest stages of the R&D process, maybe at the sort of preclinical proof of concept phase, focus on financing to effectively create a more efficient open biotech pipeline that really fosters this sort of collaboration. A big part of that is helping to make drug discovery natively digital by bringing assets and R&D data onto this globally accessible platform where it can be shared and collaboratively developed. Working with scientists and investors as well as industry partners to facilitate these collaborations and accelerate discovery and time to market. And then further just allowing this sourcing of collaborative sort of collaborations and development projects in a global scale by everyone from universities to contract research organizations, and all the way through eventually to really patients. And sort of if you take our hypotheses to sort of the furthest degree, our goal in the future is to really broaden access to ownership of therapeutic IP all the way down to patients. And the sort of example that I often make was, imagine that if diabetics collectively owned insulin, how powerful that would be from an access perspective, from a pricing perspective. And would that be a way to facilitate fundamental change within the pharmaceutical industry and realign incentives in order to create fairer and better pricing structures for drugs and their development? This is just sort of a brief visual about how this would look, how you could basically, as an investor or a collaborator, search different therapeutic areas at different stages, be able to complete bounties for collaboration while being exposed to the actual intellectual property and ownership in exchange for your work. And on the investor side, be able to actually find assets and projects that fit within your sort of portfolio. Um, yeah. And this is just another example of how these assets could potentially come to market. You can have an IP creator that basically uploads their asset to the platform. You have research groups that contribute research data and receive funding. On the other side of it, investors and sort of early speculators can contribute funds and receive shares in this vehicle. This can be moved along, increasingly worked on by additional groups, eventually CROs, and even have patient advocacy groups submitting funding and shares. This is particularly valuable in the context of trying to create frameworks for orphan drugs to be developed, and drugs that pharmaceutical companies might otherwise not be interested in, and also longevity. And eventually these can be bought out or licensed or even collaboratively commercialized, so long as the right stakeholders with the right expertise are part of these markets. At Molecule, we really believe the future of drug development is decentralized, collaborative, and increasingly open source. Over the next 10 years, we're trying to create an alternative, modular, open source drug development pipeline to compete with big pharma or run alongside it. A mechanism for patients to own equity in therapeutics related to their diseases. A new open financial market and asset class for therapeutic and chemical IP. And ultimately a platform that hosts hundreds to thousands of promising research projects, collaborations, and assets across therapeutic areas, hopefully capturing and being able to compete with a significant share of the pharma market. One of our pilot projects is this collaboration with the University of Copenhagen and the Shabai-Knudsen Laboratory, and the focus is on discovering and repurposing therapeutics that lead to healthy aging and longer lifespan. My background is in biogerontology. It's one of my passions and really my focus, and I believe that the future of something as powerful as longevity therapeutics and drugs to extend lifespan in the end should be collectively owned by everyone. People facing, everyone faces these challenges, everyone ages, and this is one of the most significant problems that we have to combat as a global society. This initial pilot project is just beginning to test some of these theses we have about how an investment into this process could work, and it's really focused on the early stages. But I'm just going to run you through some aspects of the project without disclosing anything particularly confidential in this deck, and give you sort of a sneak peek into the sort of work that we're doing and the types of projects that we're working with. As many of you know, and I'm sure you don't need any convincing, aging and life expectancy is one of the greatest economic and social challenges of our times. For most of human history, life expectancy was less than 40 years. And over the past 100 years, life expectancy has steadily increased, largely driven by the advent of antibiotics and the ability to treat communicable diseases. But that said, preventing frailty and disability late in life, now that people are living longer, has really become a massive societal challenge, not only from a health perspective, but also from a global economic perspective and from a productivity perspective. And to this end, anti-aging therapies hold tremendous promise in extending health and lifespan, really by changing the way that medicine works, really creating more of a preventative focus as opposed to a retroactive treating sort of focus. And I think that is the most substantial promise that these sort of therapies hold. As I mentioned, novel anti-aging therapies could really extend lifespan and health span by preventing macromolecular damage accumulation and ultimately age-related disease. To date, more than 100 compounds have been shown to extend the lifespan of model organisms, yet in humans, no drug is currently recognized to extend lifespan. Given the large diversity of approved drugs that are able to extend the lifespan of model organisms, it is highly likely that multiple drugs are able to extend the lifespan of humans. And this is a quote from Dr. Morten Shabai-Knudsen, who is one of the world's leading scientists in DNA damage and age-related disease. He's an associate professor at the Center for Healthy Aging at the University of Copenhagen, where his lab is mostly focused on the cellular and organismal consequences of DNA damage with a focus on creating interventions. And previously, he was at the National Institute on Aging, which is part of the National Institutes on Health. He's the founder of MitoDB, which is a large mitochondrial disease database. and the founder and owner of one of the largest recruitment platforms for clinical trial study participants in Denmark, as well as a scientific advisor on the Longevity Fund, and also the chief editor of a New Frontiers journal focused on aging. To date, his group has received, I believe, about $10 million in nonprofit funding from many of the best-in-class institutions. There's a big focus in his laboratory on working to understand the cellular and organismal consequences of DNA damage. And they have discovered in many cases that DNA damage leads to changes in certain metabolites, and that the ability to replenish these metabolites may be able to alter the rate of aging in model organisms. This is a similar focus for the Center of Healthy Aging at the university, and they really focus on this sort of interdisciplinary study that connects all aspects of aging from the cellular to the societal levels. And some of the previous funding sources have been from some incredible institutions and government funding sources globally and within Denmark. This is, for me, the most exciting part of the project, and something that I think is really going to be quite groundbreaking in the context of the longevity space. The Schaby-Knudsen laboratory, through unprecedented and exclusive access to a really significant and large human clinical data set, has identified more than 10 molecules that appear to have a very significant effect on lifespan and aging. And this is really the first study of its kind globally in which a laboratory has been granted exclusive access to be able to analyze ultimately the Danish population's health and medical records. And this is an extremely unique and valuable data set that contains 1.5 billion prescriptions covering 4.8 million individuals, over 3,500 different prescription medications, and 40 years of longitudinal data. And from this very large longitudinal data set, the Schaby-Knudsen laboratory was able to identify that there are a significant number of already approved, FDA-approved therapeutics that appear to have a very statistically significant effect on lifespan. And some of these are therapeutics that have not been previously described to have this effect in literature, so not metformin, for example. The project here will focus on optimizing, repurposing, and reformulating the 3 drugs that appear to have the strongest effect on human lifespan, or the most statistically significant effect, but can expand to include additional drugs in the future. And at this point, the identities of the molecules are not disclosed in this presentation to protect the viability of the intellectual property, and are referred to as X, Y, and Z. 3 lead molecules will be pursued for preclinical trials and drug repurposing, which will hopefully lead to the first commercially available FDA-approved pro-longevity therapeutics. These are all drugs that have been prescribed, as I mentioned, for other indication and diseases, and the molecules are all FDA-approved, which means they have robust and pre-existing clinical data sets. These drugs could ultimately be used to target health and lifespan, as well as other age-related diseases, providing many opportunities for repurposing. But to confirm the findings from this database, it will first be necessary to test how the compounds impact aging in controlled model organisms. The laboratory will be taking a 2-pronged approach to investigate the effect of these drugs in human cells and culture, and also in Drosophila melanogaster fruit flies, which is a well-used model to study aging. But the important and exciting thing to remember is this is an interesting project because it's already dealing with a large wealth of data on how these drugs affect humans. At this point, it's really to understand mechanism and be able to improve on what's there. But this is really so exciting because it comes from a very large clinical data set where there's already very robust data on how these drug effects affect humans longitudinally. This is really timely because interest in funding in the longevity and aging research space is growing rapidly. As many of you know, I don't think you need convincing. But being a relatively new sort of therapeutic field, particularly from a clinical perspective, the number of promising companies in the field is still somewhat small. But what we're seeing is these sort of record high financings. And this is really, I mean, many people believe ultimately a global multi-trillion-dollar market opportunity. When you look at the entire space, some of the record highs are Samimed's $438 million round, or Cellularity's $210 million Series A round. And these are huge deal sizes that are really happening with assets in the sort of preclinical phases. None of these companies have an approved therapeutic yet. Many of them don't even have a therapy in the clinic. And what we're trying to offer with Molecule is the ability to invest into these projects that are quite promising in their early sort of preclinical stages, and the ability for people to buy into these projects at a much lower cost, where the valuation is really driven directly by the funding that's needed to move that therapeutic closer to market. With adequate funding, the first preclinical studies could be completed by the end of 2021, and clinical trials could be pursued as early as 2024. We're in this stage here, where this first financing event is going to occur, and afterwards we'll be filing some of the patent protections on these molecules, particularly for, it wouldn't be composition of matter patents, but rather looking at formulations and methods of use and things like that. And then we will do subsequent raises for further preclinical studies and eventually clinical trials in human beings. The model that we use is quite unique. It's this virtual spin-off approach, meaning that a virtual spin-off is formed to hold the research IP and data from the university. The spin-off and the University of Copenhagen enter into a contract research agreement. And this spin-off you could think of again as a virtual pharma. That virtual pharma funds the cost of the studies and the clinical trials for the Rejuvenation laboratory, and it's used as a fundraising vehicle, as I mentioned previously. The spin-off owns and receives all the intellectual property and data generated in these studies, and investors can purchase shares in this spin-off to collectively fund the development of this therapeutic, quite similar to an equity financing. Further, eventually, an experienced biotech executive or CEO assists in the part-time management and business development of this vehicle. But really, the benefit of this model is that the researchers, particularly those in academia that don't want to become founders of companies and that want to be able to focus on their research and continuing their academic career, can do so instead of focusing on company building. We try to focus on getting in strategic investors, so people with experience in this field and also experience in the commercialization of therapeutics, and they're able to get in at a lower cost and with a higher level of control and also participation. Part of this can also be collectively owned by individuals. One of the things we're exploring is to try out these first sort of public financing frameworks where individuals would also be able to own equity stakes in this sort of project, and collaboratively develop or collaboratively own the intellectual property and fund its development. And all this IP that's encapsulated in the spin-off can either be sold downstream in the later clinical phases to another buyer to deal with the distribution and marketing, or can be collaboratively commercialized by the stakeholders that participate. The IP strategy is we have a legal team that actually focuses on handling this and creating the sort of longevity patent portfolio. A spin-off company is granted, the virtual spin-off is granted an irrevocable, perpetual, royalty-free license to use the existing IP and its data as an exclusive contract research agreement. And various patent strategies can be pursued and filed in various areas, whether it's a method of treatment or a formulation or some combination thereof. We're sort of looking at this as something akin to a pre-seed financing, and we're raising $750,000 to perform preclinical studies, carry out the data collection, out-license the IP from the university, and begin patent applications to form the spinoff. This is sort of just a breakdown of the costs that are associated. And this is the sort of strategy that we are pursuing to take these research projects out of academia and move them closer and closer to commercialization. This is Morten's laboratory team. There's about 20 members in his laboratory in total, but I've just highlighted some of the key people and the senior people that will be working on this project. Yeah, and if you have any questions, you could reach out to the research lead himself, Dr. Morten Rejuvenation. This is his email address here. Or for more about the investment opportunity, you can contact me, Tyler Golato. My email is tyler@molecule.to. Yeah, and thank you guys so much for the opportunity to present today. I think what we're trying to build with Molecule will have really interesting applications to the longevity space in the long run. And the hope is that eventually we can really sort of decentralize and democratize drug development, research, funding, collaboration, etc. Yeah, I know it's a virtual conference, so it's a little bit more difficult to interact one-on-one, but I would really appreciate that if you have any questions or interest, do feel free to reach out to me. I would love to have conversations with any of you. Thank you so much and have a great day.